Are the Phoenix Suns closing in on Jimmy Butler? ESPN's Tim Bontemps is here to help us break it down.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome to Locked On Heat, your daily podcast on the Miami Heat. Whether you're tuning in on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. I'm Wes Goldberg here with David Ramil, and joining us today is the senior NBA writer for ESPN, Lord of the MVP straw poll. It's Tim Bontemps. Tim, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Sure, guys. How we doing?
Doing well. It's been a hectic few weeks here in Miami.
Hey, you don't say. I can't imagine why.
Have a great show for you today. Before we jump in, a reminder that today's episode is sponsored by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Tim, you were just in Miami for a few days. You were covering, I imagine you were here covering the Jimmy Butler situation. Unless
I was. That's why really, I was
there. Really interested in the Khalil Ware, Bam Adebayo front court, perhaps.
I was interested in that, but that is not why I was assigned to go to Miami.
Right, I would imagine that. Then on Tuesday night, the Suns traded their 2031 first to the Jazz for 3 first-round picks. Based on the people that you've talked to, how has last night's trade maybe changed the league-wide view of whether or not the Suns can get Jimmy Butler?
I don't think it fundamentally changes the calculus for me too much. Look, obviously now the Suns have now multiple picks to put into a deal rather than having one, which they had before. However, they had one pretty valuable pick, and now they have 3 not very valuable picks, right? So it's sort of like taking $100 and saying, hey, can you give me $50 now? Go to a bank and say, hey, can you give me $50 now? You get 2 20s and a 10. And then the bank says, well, to do that, we're going to need $100 in 7 years, right? That's sort of what the Suns did here. So could that potentially allow them to connect picks with multiple pieces to get something done that creates a scenario where they get Jimmy Butler? I'm not going to rule it out just because it's the NBA and who knows. But ultimately, I think if you're looking at this trade scenario and where Miami sits, I've reported this on both our podcast and with Brian Windhorst in our column on Fridays. If you look at where the Heat are headed and what they're trying to do, I think the things to look for are some combination of guys that can help them play now, young pieces that can help them in the future, draft capital, and salary that doesn't go past next year, right? Because the summer 26, there's a bunch of interesting players available. It seems clear the Heat are at least trying to position themselves to be in play then. I'm not saying Miami's getting all of that stuff in a trade. It's pretty clear, despite, however you feel about Jimmy Butler as a player, he's in his mid-30s. He makes a lot of money. There's not a huge market for his services, but the Heat are going to get some combination of that stuff if they do a deal. And I don't think they're going to, for example, take themselves out of, say, 26 free agency unless they're getting a whole lot in return, right? And like the more you get in return, the more you're willing to give up. It's like a sliding scale, right? So unless you can meet those parameters in some form when you're looking at possible deals, I don't think that anything that doesn't hit at least some of those markers, and probably multiple of them, or I should say probably, potentially multiple of them, is going to get a deal done here. And so I think whatever Phoenix does between now and the deadline, and obviously they have a lot of motivation to try to do a Jimmy deal, I think if you're looking at it in terms of whether a deal actually happens or not, that's the question you have to answer is, are the Heat getting some or all of those things in a deal or any of them? And if the answer is no, it's probably not one that's going to happen.
Was it always Phoenix? Because we've heard, obviously when the trade deadline was first, when the trade request was first reported, it was any team but Miami. And then you hear maybe Milwaukee's interested, maybe Memphis is interested, and then you hear rumblings that he's not going to sign there or he's not interested in joining any of those teams. Was it always Phoenix as far as Jimmy Butler was concerned?
Look, it's hard. I'm not going to make really any absolute statements about anything because, we're talking about somebody who I think it's hard to make any absolute statements about, as we've seen in the past, both in terms of team success and individual decision-making. But I think in general, again, the way you have to look at it is we've talked a lot this year about the fact that, at least we have on our pod and stuff, about how difficult it is to make trades in this current situation the league is in, and um, and how hard it is in particular to move big salaries, right? So if you're going to get a deal like this done, and let's say whether you're really motivated to trade for Jimmy or not, you have to make a lot of things happen to move a $50 million salary. So just off the jump, if you say, hey, a $50 million player is available, it's going to be hard to move that player just because of the financial restrictions that are on so many teams in the league right now. Then you factor into it that Jimmy wants to get an extension. There's only certain teams that make sense to really go after a guy like him, because if you're a rebuilding team or a team that's sort of in the middle, it doesn't really make a ton of sense probably to be trying to go hard after a guy who's in his mid-30s who's going to cost a lot of money, right? So then you've got a narrow pool of teams that make sense to get him. And some of those teams, like Phoenix, are going after him in part because they're in such a restricted position. They don't really have a lot of options otherwise to do something, right? Like we're talking about Phoenix because they have Bradley Beal with a giant contract with a no trade clause. And Jimmy Butler's a much better player. If they could turn Bradley Beal into Jimmy Butler, that makes them a much better team. So obviously it makes sense for them to try to do it. But they also are in that position because they don't really have anything else they can do. So that's why it's such a complicated thing to sort out. And it's why I think there's certainly a world where we're sitting here on February 7th and Jimmy's still on the team, because you have to really thread a tight needle to get a deal that the Heat are going to be willing to do and that another team is going to be able to make. And so unless that happens, I think there's a real chance that this goes to the summer. And then you get to the summer, and as we saw with the Karl Anthony Towns trade and some of these other deals, you get into the offseason, there's a lot more flexibility. There's a lot more ability for teams to maneuver around, rosters expand. You can play around in a lot of different ways that you can't in January and February. So, I know that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I do think this is just a really difficult situation, and it's not one that I think there's an obvious answer to as to how it's going to play out, because while I think everybody involved would like to find a resolution here, it's not going to be, oh, well, we have to do something by February 6th, no matter what. So if we're sitting here on February 6th and it's just a bad deal, then we'll take a bad deal and we'll be done with it. Like, I just don't see a world where the Heat are going to do that. I think unless they can get something decent, I think this will end up going to the summertime because, like I said, I just don't think they're going to do something just to do it to get this over with.
Today's episode is brought to you by Talkspace. Listen, everybody needs therapy. I've been there. Therapy is a game changer. It can help manage stress, improve sleep, and communicate more effectively. But finding the right therapist and finding a session and fitting a session into a busy schedule can be a challenge. And that's where Talkspace comes in, because Talkspace is the leading virtual therapy provider. They make getting the help you need easy, accessible, and affordable. With Talkspace, signing up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist who fits your needs, usually within 48 hours. And it's convenient. You can have sessions from the comfort of your home and even message your therapist between appointments. Plus, Talkspace is covered by many insurance plans. And for most insured members, there's a $0 copay. It's never been easier to prioritize mental health. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $80 off your first month with Talkspace when you go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNBA and enter the promo code SPACE80 to match with a licensed therapist today. Go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNBA and enter the promo code SPACE80 to get $80 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNBA, promo code SPACE80. We'll be right back.
So, what's funny is in the NBA, the whole phrase of like where there's a will, there's a way sometimes just plays out. And when you have people that are really motivated to get something done, sometimes creativity and that sort of will can sort of help these trades sort of materialize. It doesn't always happen, but when I think about this case in particular, Tim, I'm like, okay, well, the Heat, they seem motivated to want to get something done, obviously, before the trade deadline. And the Phoenix Suns are clearly out here motivated, trying to turn Bradley Beal into Jimmy Butler. But you were around the team a little bit. I'm curious, like when you're talking to people in Miami these last few days, like I keep getting the sense, at least over these last few days, the awkwardness of this situation has permeated every layer of the organization. Like there is a clear cloud hanging over the team. Did you kind of get that sense over these last few days?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think everybody, like I said, I think everybody sort of wants the same outcome here in some form, right? Which is to find a way to resolve this in a way where the Heat get something decent and Jimmy Butler goes elsewhere. But again, I just don't think that means the Heat are going to make a trade just to get it over with.
No.
So that's the problem. It's like everybody here wants the same outcome in some form or fashion, I think. But it doesn't mean that the right outcome for everybody involved is going to present itself. So that's where I think we just have to wait and see how things go between now and February 6th. And my guess is we're probably sitting here in a couple of weeks in the first full week of February, waiting to see if something comes across the board that gets done. And perhaps it will happen and perhaps it won't. But yeah, I mean, nothing about this situation I think is enjoyable for anybody. And, these things happen in the league. It's not the first time there's been this kind of situation. You can go back through time, go back to Dwight Howard in Orlando or Carmelo Anthony in Denver or, James Harden in Brooklyn, Ben Simmons in Philadelphia. Like,
because you covered a lot of those situations very closely, specifically the ones with Harden and Brooklyn and stuff like that, because you're up. Where does this like rank in terms of weirdness scale? Like,
I don't think it's particularly different than any of those. Like, remember, Ben Simmons showed up to a practice with a phone in his pocket.
Right.
There's been all kinds of weird things that have gone. I mean, Dwight Howard announced he wasn't going to get traded after a plane ride home from San Antonio where he had a bunch of candy on a plane. Weird things happen in the NBA. But what's different about this one is the new CBA and the restrictions it's put on deal making. So it's just made it a lot harder. For example, in the past, the Suns could take on money in deals. They could put together, they could have taken Yusuf Nurkic and Bradley Beal and something else and taken on a bunch of money and they could just open Matt Ishbia's checkbook and say, sure, we'll spend a ton of money. We don't care. Right? Now, they can't do that even if they want to. There's stuff like that they, the league has put in place in part to make sure that teams can't just spend whatever they want, that have made it really difficult for deals to get done. And when you combine that with the fact that you have teams like Milwaukee and Phoenix and these other teams that have already traded virtually all their draft picks, and in Phoenix's case, they've already done multiple swaps with the picks they had left, there's just not a lot there for them to put in a deal. So they're sitting here with a limited pool of assets to begin with and salaries that are not very appealing to teams to get. Then it's okay, we want to turn them into a good player. Now, it's not unprecedented for that to work in the league, but it's a hard thing to square. And I think when you combine that with the fact that it's just difficult for teams to take on the salary of Jimmy's size in the middle of the season, and the fact that he's 35, and it only makes sense for him to really be on a team that's really trying to win, there's just not a lot of suitors that make a ton of sense. And that's where I think we're just sort of in a holding pattern right now where, I don't think there's a ton of urgency to do this much before the deadline now because of where everything sits. You've only got 2 weeks to go, see where it lands. And, the deadlines tend to create urgency. And perhaps stuff will materialize over the next couple of weeks that results in the kind of deal everybody's looking for. But I think it's safe to say if there was a good deal on the table, a trade would already be done. So the fact that one hasn't been done would lead me to say that there's not a deal on the table that the Heat are willing to do. And the question just ultimately is, will that change between now and February 6th? And I don't really know if we're going to know the answer to that until 3 p.m. on the 6th.
Beyond the complexity of the transaction itself, though, I think like part of the weirdness is that I don't think anybody really saw this coming for years. And maybe it was kind of overstated to a certain degree, but it felt like the marriage between Jimmy Butler and the Heat organization were so closely aligned. And obviously they had achieved some success. But how does the rest of the league view this? Like it just feels like it was completely out of left field, despite Jimmy's past. It felt like he had been moved beyond that, and he had finally found what he has said was home. Like he found a franchise that really accepted him, allowed him to be who he is, etc. And yet somehow it's all turned around so quickly. And I think that's part of what a lot of people are having, especially here in South Florida, are having a hard time processing, is that nobody really saw this coming. How do you think the rest of the league views this? Because again, from our perspective, it just seems like this was not a scenario that was likely to happen. And here we are, where it's almost a guarantee that Jimmy will no longer play for the Miami Heat.
Why is this a scenario that was not likely to happen? I think you're in the extreme minority to say that that's the case. Just gonna
because of Jimmy's past.
Not to try to poke at you on your own podcast, but I don't.
No,
I don't think.
Well,
I don't think
you
very
mean
many
up
people in the
until
league
Pat
were
Riley's
surprised.
comments, maybe? I think Pat Riley's comments is sort of what changed, David, if I could, Pat Riley's comments is sort of what kind of turned everything sideways, but maybe do you mean almost before the end of season press conference where he called out Jimmy Butler? Is that sort of what you're talking about, David?
Well, I mean, yeah, obviously. I think there was
now everybody had seen it coming after Riley called out Jimmy Butler.
There was tension. Yeah, there was tension, and the idea was that obviously the contract situation made things worse, but I mean, prior to that, it felt like, again, for years, Jimmy had talked about this being the franchise that accepted him, that allowed him to be who he is, that kind of embraced his work ethic and everything else like that. And I think, again, from the perspective of a lot of Heat fans, not myself, but other Heat fans, the thought was Jimmy and the Miami Heat were as closely aligned as you can possibly be between a star player who has reportedly been, a little cantankerous and hard to deal with in other franchises. But it didn't feel like that was going to be the case moving forward. So I think that's just what a lot of Heat fans are curious about. And I know, obviously, your colleague Ramona Shelburne has reported about how things turned south so quickly. But that's my question is just, did the rest of the league kind of view that this was a likelihood, or did they just think that, did they ever see this coming? Because I don't think a lot of Heat fans have.
Yep.
We have a saying on the Who Collective, actions over words. And
Sure.
the act of Jimmy Butler over an extended period of time would indicate that this would happen at some point. And frankly, I think everybody was sort of aware this was a possibility when they get extended this summer, right?
Okay.
The idea that we're sitting here right now, I don't think the Heat are surprised, really, that we're sitting here in some form like this. I think the hope was they would get to the summer and then assess where things were at. I shouldn't say they weren't expecting something to happen now, but I think they were hopeful they could get through the year and then see where it's at, right?
No.
But, I mean, at the end of the day, the Heat traded Josh Richardson, Hassan Whiteside, and a first-round pick for Jimmy Butler. This has been a great partnership for everybody involved, and it's not exactly the same as, the fact that the Warriors aren't that good this year with Steph Curry, but, the Warriors have had an incredible run with Steph Curry, and it's okay that the team is not in title contention, and the Heat have had a tremendous run with Jimmy Butler, and it's okay that it's going to end in this sort of fashion. It doesn't take away from the run that they've had, and it doesn't diminish the impact Jimmy's had there. But it's also, to me, not surprising that we see a guy who is not under contract after this year, has a player option for next year, would like to get extended, has not been extended, and therefore wants to get traded. This is a scenario we have seen play out many, many, many times in the history of the league. And that's when it's not including somebody who has a track record of, when he's not happy in a situation, wanted to get to a new one. So, I don't think anyone in the league is particularly stunned that we're sitting here on January 22nd and Jimmy wants to be traded. Now, would the Heat prefer, as I said, that this had happened on June 22nd and they could do something at the draft? Sure. That would have been better for everybody. I think they hoped that they could really have another deep playoff run this year. But yeah, the ultimate answer to your question is no. I don't think the league is particularly surprised that this is happening now. The question again just comes back to, can the Heat find a deal they're willing to do by the deadline or not?
Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Who doesn't love going to live events? I know I sure do, whether it's sports or music or theater or comedy. If you're going to a Heat game, you love the atmosphere there. It's so fun. Everybody enjoys going to a Heat game. It's a heck of an experience. The energy and excitement is always unforgettable. And now Gametime has made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite events with their new feature, Gametime Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only the incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Recently, I was looking for tickets to an upcoming concert. I used the Gametime app with Gametime Picks. I found amazing deals and could even see the view from my seat before buying. It was a venue I'd never been to. Really convenient. And the super deal is particularly impressive because it offers you those great seats at unbeatable prices. Plus, the app's all-in pricing shows the total cost right up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply, but create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. You get $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It's Gametime. We'll be right back.
So you mentioned the Warriors there. Even like you could put the Lakers in this conversation too. It's not this quite like they won a championship with LeBron. I guess you could put them in this conversation. The Heat. These are sort of the teams that had won in the past or had been winning in the past that under this new sort of firmish salary cap are kind of being forced to rebuild on the fly a little bit. And they're kind of the first teams that are having to do it, right? Like you see the Boston Celtics. They kind of built most of it, the real essential parts of this before the new salary cap. Even Cleveland, you could argue, did a lot of their work before the new salary cap structure kind of got into place here. So in some respect, I think the league has made it harder to build great teams. It's also made it harder for great teams to stay together. So when you're looking at a team without a Miami Heat team without Jimmy Butler, whether that happens before February 6th or in the summer or whenever, whenever it happens, how do you view a team like the Heat and how they need to build in this new sort of firmish salary cap world where it's sort of intentionally built for parity? It's like, I think there was a time even when the Golden State Warriors were as dominant as they were that you would talk to teams around the league and they'd be like, you know what, we kind of just have to wait this out a little bit. And when Kevin Durant ultimately left, it was kind of a breath of fresh air for everybody because it kind of opened up the pathways to championships. I don't think that that's the case now. It kind of feels like as dominant as the Celtics were last year and might be, the shelf life for these teams don't last as long. So if you're a team like the Heat, maybe even though it's harder to build, the retool could happen faster in a weird sense because I guess that barrier for entry isn't so hard anymore. Does that make sense?
I think, honestly, the answer to your question is it's too early to tell.
Mm.
It's too early to tell how to get to the next championship level team, and it's too early to tell what the long-term ramifications of the CBA are. Like, for example, there hasn't really been a lot of movement in free agency for several years because the salary cap did not grow at all for a 4-year period, basically because of COVID. And all the salaries for players are going up 5 and 8% a year, right? Which is why we're in a situation where so many of these teams are banged up against these aprons and in the second apron and can't do anything because the cap grew hardly at all and player salaries grew a lot. Now, over the next 5 years, the salary cap is probably going to grow somewhere around 10% a year. The aprons are all going to grow by 10% a year. The luxury tax is going to grow by 10% a year because they're all now tied to the salary cap growing. So you're going to see natural growth in the system outpace the growth of contracts. And as some of these contracts that are signed come off the books, then we're going to see a lot more flexibility. And we will see, like, will free agency become a thing again? Will everybody just extending go away? Will you still have to trade for guys, right? So, I mean, what the Heat have shown over time is an ability to get star players to come to Miami. It's obviously a place people want to play. And they have shown a level of creativity and flexibility to find different paths to getting players. So if you're a Heat fan looking at it, you would say the Heat are a team that's well positioned to be a factor sort of regardless what the rules are in the league going forward. But what's hard to know is, you know, like, let's say we fast forward to 2026 and the Heat are sitting there with a ton of cap space. Are there going to be good players available? Are they all going to extend? Are there just going to be guys that you're like, maybe this would work, but it's probably not a great fit? It's just very hard to tell exactly what all of that is going to look like. And I think we really need to see what the next year or two look like in terms of where the league is positioned and where some of these guys coming into free agency decide to do and what the overall ecosystem from a financial standpoint that the league is in. I think until we see some of that play out, it's going to be hard to know just how much things shift in one direction or another, which again, I know that's not the best answer if you're a Heat fan going, well, how is this team going to get there again? But like,
no, but it's right. It's accurate,
yeah,
right? We have no idea.
That's sort of the challenge of this current system. It's like when the CBA came in a couple of years ago, people thought there'd be some changes, but like there were a lot more changes than people expected. And we're still seeing the ripple effects of that. And they're all still there. I think there might even still be one or two things to come online this summer. I can't remember if they all went into effect this past year or not. So like there was a tiered integration of the new CBA into the system. It's all happened now. And so now it's a matter of seeing, okay, what's going to happen over the next couple of years to show where the league is really at. I feel confident that Pat Riley and Andy Ellsberg and Adam Simon in the Heat front office is going to be right there figuring out this stuff as fast as anybody because they've shown an ability to do that for 20 years now, 30 years now. And those guys are really smart and good at their jobs, and I think they'll figure it out. But there isn't a clear path right now. The Heat are potentially, we'll see if the Heat make the playoffs. Obviously, there's a rough game against Portland on Tuesday. It's a middling roster right now. We'll see what happens with Jimmy. It's unclear they make the playoffs, as you guys well know. If they don't make the playoffs and they have 2 unprotected picks out there, that makes it harder to make trades, right? So there's just a lot of stuff that is left to be left unresolved right now that has to resolve itself over the next 4 to 6 months, and really even over the next couple of weeks. Because let's see, I mean, maybe the Heat end up with some great package for Jimmy, and things go one way. Maybe they end up with a middling package and it goes another way. Maybe they can't get anything done, and we are sort of in a holding pattern until June or July to see what happens with this. So until you know that first domino, and then you can see, okay, where do the Heat sit after that? I think it's hard to really make any strong statements about what the next championship iteration of the team will look like. And until you see a Jimmy Butler trade and you see what happens this season as far as making the playoffs goes, those are the first two things they're going to tell you, okay, here's what the Heat have at their disposal over the next 2 to 3 years to try to build the next championship team, which I'd assume would include Bam Adebayo. That's the one thing I feel pretty confident about, is he's going to be in the middle of whatever that team is. And then it's like, okay, what else is around him? I think we'll have to just wait and see.
Last thing here, Tim, and really appreciate the time here, man.
Sure.
You are around the team for several of these playoff runs, especially these conference finals in Boston and some of those classic matchups that we got. Just story time to finish us out here. Do you have a favorite story, having been around this team at any point over these last 5.5 years? A most memorable moment, anything that kind of jumps out to you?
I mean, it's just all three of those runs. I mean, I was in the bubble for the whole run Miami had into 2020. I was at the conference finals in 22 and the semifinals against the Sixers, when they went to the finals. Or they lost in the conference finals, I should say. And then in 23, I was around them for, that series when they got back to the finals again. And we're up 3-0 and then almost blew it. And then, won Game 7 going away in Boston. Like, they were fascinating runs, and Jimmy was a fascinating player in the middle of it. And, the Heat and Celtics have had so many matchups over the years. Like, all three of those series just had super fun, memorable moments, and they were fascinating battles. And, you can make a real argument. This 5-year stretch that they had was the second best era in the history of the franchise. Like, if you want to say that winning a title supersedes all that in 06, I can understand that. But this team, it's been a bizarre run, right? Because they were the underdog in the first round in 4 of the 5 years, and yet they made 3 conference finals, 2 finals, and especially in 2020, if Bam and Goran aren't hurt, maybe they win that series against the Lakers in the bubble.
David has been on that hill for years now.
But either way, right? Yeah. It's like that was a great run. It was that was a crazy situation, and the Heat really embraced it and attacked it in a way that few other teams did, and that's why they got through the gauntlet they did. Did you try the big face coffee in the bubble? Did you ever get a chance? I was not in that tier in the bubble. I was in the secondary tier, so I was watching I was in
Jimmy
the
had the
same
big
tiers.
face tier, and then you had everybody else
Yes,
in a different
the
tier.
players were in the tier 1. I was in tier 2. So I was with,
Got it.
I was in the same tier as ownership and front office executives. So it was me and Andy Ellsberg and Pat Riley and Mickey Harrison and Jeannie Buss. And like, that was the crew that I was around every day. But, yeah, like it's just been a really fun and interesting 5-year stretch. And like I said earlier, it's been an unmitigated success for everybody involved. But like most things in the NBA, it, I think, has run its course for everybody involved. And again, it just comes back to what is the next chapter for everybody involved. And I mean, I hope for my sake, if not anybody else's, that we have an answer by February 6th, because it would be nice to just move on from this story. But it's unclear that that'll be the case. And like I said, what I do feel confident in is that the Miami Heat will not just do a deal to turn the page and just like, oh, well, we can't get anything good, so we'll just take the best thing that's available. And if it hamstrings us for 3 years, whatever. Like, I don't think that's what is going to happen. So, whatever, again, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. If you're a Heat fan and you want to see where this thing is going to go, any deal that doesn't bring some combination of guys that can help now, young players, draft picks, and salary that expires in the next 18 months, I don't think that that's something the Heat are going to do. And if you're not getting some of those things, the price to do the deal goes higher. So, that's the scale in which I would grade any idea that comes along. And I think that's the rubric that the Heat are going to stick to between now and February 6th, and we'll see where this winds up.
Tim Bontemps, ESPN, ESPN.com, the Hoop Collective podcast. Thanks so much for jumping on, man. This was fun.
Anytime, guys. Thanks for having me.